Hello, Salt Strong family. My name is Rich Natoli. I'm here today to talk about a little bit about a re-emerging fishery within the Mid-Atlantic. And I'm talking the area that I fish most often, and that's Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey, and New York. We've had a fishery here in the past that was amazing. It went away for quite a while, and it's coming back, and it's just surging, and that's Sheepshead. And when I tell you that we now have a good Sheepshead fishery, I'm talking about monster fish, over 10-pound fish. And in this video, we're going to talk about those fish and which 3 baits I recommend using when targeting them. All right, so before we dive into the top 3 baits, I do want to make a couple of points. Now, younger Sheepshead will have slightly different diets than the older, larger Sheepshead, and the break-off is typically around 14 to 15 inches. So when Sheepshead are smaller and when they're young, they're going to be focused in on a lot of mollusks like clams and mussels and oysters. And those are typically the things that you can catch the smaller ones on. They have a very limited diet as compared to the older, more mature Sheepshead. Now, that doesn't mean you can't catch the larger Sheepshead with those baits. However, once they get to around 14 to 15 inches, they like to diversify their diets and they start to look for a little bit more variety in what they're eating. At that point, you start looking at things like crabs and sand fleas, also called mole crabs, even minnows and worms like bloodworms or sandworms. And of course, when talking about nearly any species of saltwater fish, you can't leave out shrimp. So with that said, I'm going to jump right into the top 3 baits for catching nice, large Sheepshead. Now, bait number 3 is a really simple one. It's actually the last one I mentioned just before this cut over to the number 3. And that's shrimp. And shrimp is a outstanding bait for pretty much anything inshore when you're fishing the entire eastern coast of the United States, and Sheepshead are no exception. You have to keep in mind though, before you're dropping shrimp anywhere, you are just inviting all of the nuisance fish to come in and attack your bait and possibly hook up on your jig or your rig, whatever you're using that day. But that doesn't mean you should ignore the bait and you shouldn't use it. Shrimp are very readily available at local bait shops. A lot of people can go out and catch their own and stock up. You can use them fresh. You can use them live. You can use them frozen. It's a viable bait, and it's something that Sheepshead will eat. Just keep in mind, again, everything else will as well. Now, when you're hooking a shrimp onto one of your jigs, and I recommend using jigs and not rigs. So I'm talking about using something like this right here, which is a Captain Hank's shepherd jig, and you can get it. You don't need to use Captain Hank's. You can use bottom sweepers, but something with this different style head on it and the hook just right there. So it keeps you from getting snagged. It presents very well in the water, and the hook you can just put right on there. The shrimp, you can thread it on, you can put it in the middle. Try to look for the most natural presentation, but as it's going down, as we all know, a shrimp is just going to get attacked as soon as it goes down the water column. The other reason that I mentioned shrimp is because a lot of times Sheepshead aren't your main focus for an entire day, especially up in the Northeast. We have very strong tidal currents and we're fishing heavy structure when we're seeking out these Sheepshead. So we're not staying in any one area for a really long time. And often if you're fishing something like a bridge, the current's going to drive you off of that bridge once the current really starts moving. So you may get 1 or 2 hours of total fishing time. So what happens quite often is somebody's going out targeting another species, and then at the top or the bottom of the tide, they take advantage of the slower moving water, and then they creep up onto those bridges and those rocks, and they start fishing for Sheepshead. So in that case, you might want to look at something like the power prawn, which is, a shrimp imitation. And I would use this when I don't have any of the other baits that I'm going to mention on board, and I just want to go down and try for the Sheepshead real quick. And just drop it right down on the jig, work that column along the piling, and put some Procure on there, some shrimp flavored Procure, some crab flavored, or even the Dr. Juice will work as you drop it down on those pilings. But number 3 is shrimp, and you can see we're getting some big fish using these tactics up in the Northeast Mid-Atlantic area. I can't believe it. Yeah. Yeah, this is a nice one. Man. That's not bad. All right, now let's talk about the second best bait that you can use when targeting large sheepshead. And it's a real simple one. It's the mole crab, also known as a sand flea. I recommend these whether you're down south, mid-Atlantic, or up north. If you can get sand fleas, they're a great bait to use when targeting sheepshead. Now, when I say sand fleas, fresh live ones are the best. Fresh dead ones, second best. But you can also use frozen sand fleas, and you're not going to have a lot of issues when you're targeting these fish. I've caught as many on frozen sand fleas as on live sand fleas, so I noticed very little difference. Now, just keep in mind, when you have frozen sand fleas, they're good to use, but you have to thaw them first, because when they're frozen, you're just going to break that shell, and once they thaw underwater, they're going to fall right off the hook, and it's going to be very difficult to keep them on. So they're very easy to thaw. They're very small. When I go out and I have frozen fleas, I just take them out of the container or open up the container, put a little bit of water in there, and they are defrosted within, just a couple of minutes, and then you can put them on the hook. Now, when putting a sand flea onto your hook, again, I don't use rigs, meaning just bare hooks. I use jigs every time. And again, I'm going to pull out one of these. It's this bottom sweeper style, or in this case, this is called a shepherd's jig. Again, you can use bottom sweeper, you can use Captain Hanks, you can use a lot of different brands. I prefer this one for sand fleas for the very simple reason of the shape of the hook. This is a sickle hook, and what it allows you to do is when you put the sand flea over top, you want very little extending off of the back, because it gives them less to grab at without grabbing the hook. So what I do is I'll put it on the hook so that it's hanging off far, and then you can just spin it around this very tight bend down here on the sickle, and it just slides underneath the barb of the hook, so it just kind of lays in this section in here. It's great because if they want to get that sand flea, they have to put the hook in their mouth. The other thing to keep in mind is if you're fishing with live sand fleas, they die very easily, and it's a very simple reason. They die because of the urine that is kept in the containers with them. So make sure that you have them in a container and you're maintaining them throughout the day, because the container that you have, if it doesn't drain, it's going to get filled up with their urine and it's going to kill them. And just like with any other type of crab, one dead crab breeds more dead crabs. So you want to try to keep them alive, keep an eye on them, keep fresh water going over them to keep them fresh and healthy, and they'll last all day for you, and you're going to have really good results. This one coming up here on the screen right now was caught on a sand flea. Yeah. Dude. Another. It's 24. And this brings us to the number one best bait for targeting large sheepshead, and it's a crab. It's specifically a fiddler crab. Now, you can use a lot of different types of crabs. You can use green crabs, you can use calico crabs, Asian shore crabs, shutter crabs, blue claw crabs. Any one of those will actually work, but for my money, it's going to be the fiddler crab first and foremost every single time. They make excellent bait, and if you can find a place where you can buy them, that's awesome, but usually you have to catch them. And I like to target the smaller ones. I'm talking dime to nickel sized fiddler crabs, really small. and those will bring in the biggest sheepshead that are out there. The sheepshead I'm going to show in a moment was caught on a dime size, so a really small dime size fiddler crab. Now when I hook them onto the jig, again, I'm using these bottom sweeper style or shepherd jigs. What I like to do is let them hover above the top. So I will just hook them in between their last two legs, and I will push it in just so the barb of the hook gets into the leg socket, and I let it sit there. So it just hovers up here. So this spot in here is open and free, and the crab is just sitting up here, and it seems to be hovering in midair. What that does is when they grab over the bulk of the crab, they end up getting the entire hook into their mouth. Now, the other thing that I also would tell you to keep in mind is with a fiddler crab or with any crab, you have to be careful with these fish about the claws that are on them. And I'm not talking about them getting you and grabbing you with the claw, which can hurt. I'm talking about the fact that if you leave a large claw of a fiddler crab on your crab while it's on your bait or on your jig, it gives them something to grab onto, which is not going to have the hook buried in it. So I always remove the big claws off of these fiddler crabs before I put them down, and that seems to cut down on the number of swipes and misses on my side. So this is the last one that I'm going to show on the video, and this was caught using a dime-sized fiddler crab on a jig, and you can see even those smallest baits can get the largest fish. Come on. Nice sheep. Nice sheep. Holy cow. Now, as we watch that big, beautiful sheep's head make its way back down to the depths and back onto that structure, just wanted to remind you, keep in mind when you're heading out on the water, sheep's head, there's a wide variety of baits, but as they get bigger, they start to diversify their habits. And when I'm going out there on the water and I'm looking for those best fish, the biggest fish that I can find, I'm going first with the fiddler crab. Then I'm going to take a look at the sand fleas or the mole crabs. And then after that, I'm going with shrimp. And I'm going to go through all the nuisance bites from all the little sea bass and tog and anything else that's around, snappers. And I'm going to go in there and I'm going to find those sheep with those shrimp. And in a pinch, I'm going to be using one of those artificials like the Power Prawn and just put a little bit of a shrimp procure or a Dr. Juice on there. And I'm going to be fishing for those sheep's head using that. So get out there, try these baits. It's going to work for you. Tight lines.